Hello, everyone. Welcome to this session of Beyond Bohm, Science, Order, and Creativity, Contemplation in Creativity. I'm James Barbieri, Associate Program Director of the Power Center, and I will be your host for today. As host, we're here to help you throughout the call, so any problems, technical or not, feel free to just drop me a message in the chat. Before we begin, I'd just like to one of a couple of Zoom rules. First of all, we ask participants to turn off their microphones during the presentation and Q&A, just to ensure good quality audio. For this reason, we may mute you if we hear any background noise. But at the same time, we do encourage everyone to turn on their cameras, as we believe seeing everyone's faces and reactions creates a nice, inclusive education environment. During Q&A and discussion, if you want to ask a question, you can either use the raise your hand function on Zoom, at the bottom of your screen under reactions, physically raise your hand, or if you're feeling shy, you can ask your question in the chat and I can read it out for you. Regarding the Q&A, as we would like to give everyone the opportunity to ask their question, we ask you to keep your questions short and focused. We also ask you to please reserve any follow-up questions until everyone has had their opportunity to participate, and then of course we can circle back to you. Regarding the chat, during the session, you will only be able to chat with us, the hosts, for any problems. But of course, we will open it up for everyone to share their thoughts during the Q&A and discussion. And finally, all sessions are recorded for archival purposes and for you all. The recording will be uploaded to Vimeo in about 3 days' time, so you should all receive the link to that. And now we can start today's session. Today we have a great group of panelists here that will be discussing dialogues, lineage, and the transmission of a participative consciousness. To lead today's panel, we honor Beth Macy, who has been a manager, leader, consultant, and participant in various organizations, where she's primarily used Bohmian dialogue, core in her research and work. Joining Beth, we welcome Mark Ryan, historian of American thought and culture, and chair and board member of several academies, including his current position as the chair of the Jonathan Edwards Trust at Yale. And finally, a familiar face here, Nichol, chair of this event and editor of David Bohm's On Dialogue, On Creativity, and the Essential David Bohm. And with that, I'll pass it over to you, Beth. Welcome.
Thank you. I have to tell you, as I was sharing with Jenna and James as we first checked in, I woke up this morning at 4 o'clock and I could not go back to sleep. So that happens often to me. It was kind of like a nudge to get up and do whatever seemed to come to be done. But at the same time, I was thinking, geez, it's 7 hours before this presentation. And so the clock wasn't moving for me this morning. It seemed like it was just going to be forever before we got here. So I'm really anxious now to share this with you. I've been getting ready all morning already here. But there's another reason that I'm anxious, and that is I think there's a query that's been working through me for a long time about dialogue. I really wanted to know why it works. What is this thing that we call dialogue that so many of us really love? What is it? And so that's taken many different forms for me. And frankly, I'm kind of tired of carrying this, feeling like it's like I'm doing it by myself. So as Lee and Mark could tell you, I've really struggled with it by myself and with their help over the summer. I'd like to find other people who are sharing this kind of query so that I could be in a community better that is carrying it, and so that I could have the participation with others who have this kind of deep query. Now, I know not all dialogue requires this kind of query. Some of us are really good at using it and applying it and making it work. I don't know why. I need to know what's going on in the middle of it. And that's certainly what's been guiding me. Now, that's guided me for a long time, since the early 90s. And part of what Pari has done for me, which has just been immense, is it's giving me a place to be able to share some of that journey with you. So if you happen to have read or were interested in the first part of this journey, Pari has put a paper online that you can take a look at that starts to look at those who informed David Bohm's idea about dialogue and give it lots of its roots. So that was really an important part for me, and Hari was kind enough to let me share that. But there's another part of it. I couldn't still get to satisfaction about why is it that dialogue really does work? What is the magic, the power that's behind it? And so that's the part that I would love to be able to share with you today is not that I've got it right, but it's kind of like I remember listening to Hester when she did the group, the round table regarding artwork. She talked about the imagination of the artist not as being the creation of artwork, but it's being able to perceive that which wants to be explicated or wants to be made into artwork. And so that's kind of the level I would like to be able to start sharing with you today. Again, it's very new, it's not finished, it's not perfect, but hopefully then we can start with others who might be interested, really explicating what it is what is this magic? What is this dynamic that informs dialogue and makes it happen so well? So that's where I'd like to go. And if you would be patient just a moment here, I want to share my screen. And make it bigger. My computer wants to be so slow today. Okay, so here we are. And first of all, let me just share kind of how we're going to work today. I want to spend a little bit of time just sharing with you some things that help set the context and help what I'm going to share hopefully have a bit more sense to you. And then I've broken my part of presenting into two sections. And after each one of those, I will ask Lee and Mark to come in and help. Either I think there's some places where I need their help to explain what I'm trying to say, and some places they may just wish to make some reflections. And then finally, we'll have some Q&A with you all, and that will be it. Now, there's something I put here at the bottom. This is some thinking, not a direct quote, but if any of you are familiar with the psychologist Wilfred Bion, this comes from his work. So he says that this would be his thought, that there's a thought without a thinker that's seeking incarnation. So the idea that there's inspirations, there's inclinations, there are inklings that are out there, and sometimes they aren't fleshed out. And so it's as if those inklings are looking for those who can take them in and make them explicit for them. And that's kind of the spirit with which I want to approach our work today. Is there's something about dialogue that really wants to come into our consciousness more fully. And so maybe we can incarnate it. Maybe we can make it explicit together. So that's where I want to start. So just to tell you a little bit about these people I want to talk about today, when I became real curious about dialogue, I started searching into it. And what I found was that David Bohm really wasn't the one who defined the original methodology of dialogue. Now that's a surprise to a lot of folks. He actually got it from Patrick Demare, who was his psychiatrist, as well as the one who operated what he called median groups within which dialogue was developed. So David Bohm learned a lot from him. But as I began studying about Demare, I learned that, a lot of his work comes from Michael Fulks. A lot of Michael Fulks's work came from Trajant Bureau. Well, so working backwards, this was the part of this lineage, as I've called it, that seemed to have the flow of dialogue most in it. Now, of course, you can go a lot further back. These guys go back to Heraclitus. And as you'll see in a bit, some of them will go back to the dawn of human beings, the dawn of the coming of human beings into the earthly realm. So this is a quick shrift of the number of people who have influenced, but it was the one that I could find the most direct relationship to dialogue and to David Bohm. Oh, and Barfield down here in the bottom is kind of a different person. He doesn't belong to this lineage, but I include him here because I think that unless we get a feel about Owen Barfield's thinking, and particularly about participative consciousness, we don't really get what David Bohm added into the equation. Of course, there's other things he added into his science, his work on thought, his work with Krishnamurti and all as well. And these two down here at the first, Carl Jung and Sigmund Freud, we're not going to talk about them today, but I think I'd be remiss if I didn't say that they had a huge impact of what we've come to think about as the methodology and the process of dialogue. Now, these three guys, Burrow, Foltz, Damari, they were all Freudian trained psychologists or psychiatrists. Trejant Burrow, in case you happen to be a Jungian, Trejant Burrow didn't do his training with Sigmund Freud. He did it with Carl Jung in Zurich in 1909. And so what we see is a lot of Jung's influence, particularly on the feminine archetype, work through Trejant Burrow's efforts and tend to show up throughout. So this is just a brief. We're going to focus on these folks today. And what I want to do is actually go beyond that first effort I made to say, where did David Bohm get this? And say, what's the common meaning that they were all working toward? So here are these people, just to give faces to these blobs that I had there. So I put this slide together and I found it really helpful to me because what I've tried to show is when they lived. And it gave me the sense of how they would have been co-working, or they would have been working off the same zeitgeist that was current as they were doing their efforts. So you can see that there is a period of pretty much overlap between them. Now there's also relationships between them. So I'm going to exclude Barfield a bit here because I don't know about his relationship with these others. But David Bohm and Patrick Damari were supposedly good friends, besides Damari being his psychiatrist, and besides David Bohm participating in his median groups, and so on and so on. There's all these interrelationships between them, and that really gave me an idea. So what I have done since this original work was to continue studying all these people with lots of help from lots of others. And I got the idea, what if instead of looking at them as really a lineage, where it assumes that their information is going from one to the other, to the other, to the other, what if I put all of their work conceptually in one bundle and said, what is it that they're saying together? What did they build together? What is the real essence that they're trying to guide us to? So that's the flow I would like to take today. I want to look at the real essence that is in the midst of dialogue and what these people together can show us. Now, there's some things that they said that were quite common, and I want to start with one of those. This looks like target practice. I call this my target practice diagram. So something that they all talk about is that in looking about how the consciousness of humankind has evolved, we have to look at it as the person in relationship to something. You can't look at the person separate from what its environment is in some way or another. These are terms that these folks use: family, network, society, earth, nature, cosmos, etc. We could put others, but these are their terms. And what I was noticing is while they all say there's a person in context, that their contexts were different. Now, it's not important to get all these details right here, but I just want to demonstrate this. Folks thought that we have to look at a person in relationship to family, that's the major influence that helps form an individual psyche. Damari said, well, that's really great, but we have to go upstream a bit, because what we really need to look at is how society impacts us. So that society tells the family how to behave. And so it's up here at the societal level, looking at societal assumptions that we get more leverage. And you'll see that David Bohm, he goes all the way out to the cosmos. So he says we have to look at the individual in context to the collective, and that in relationship to the whole cosmos. So you can see that there's some difference here. Now, so again, the point is self in relation to something. But that led me to some other questions. And I don't know, this has been sticking in my mind and keeps bouncing around with new questions about it and new ways to look. So I'll just share some that came to me. But one is, it's like we all have a circumference of our worldview. What is ours? What's yours? What's mine? And if you think about being in a conversation with someone else, or particularly in a dialogue, you're going to be people who have very different worldviews. The circumference can be cosmic, or it could be very, very close at hand. Or we could have, as we see a lot of today, people who are clear here in the center, and it seems like their circumference only surrounds themselves. So there's all sorts of variation. But if we can think about that, it gives us a lot of ideas about how we confront other people without realizing it. I mean, how we confront their differences of attitudes without understanding sometimes why. So another thing would be, what is it that brings us to have those different circumferences? And I think that's part of what these various authors, these various lineage members might share with us. Now today, I want to take a really expansive perspective on dialogue. So I'm not talking here about how to conduct a dialogue or the methodology. I'm trying to look at the pattern that's beyond it, that inhabits it. So here, first of all, I'm going to borrow from Owen Barfield, whose work seems to really orient around the evolution of consciousness. So I think we've got a really big pattern here that I'm trying to bring to your attention. And I'm just going to say that dialogue fits in very deeply into that whole process of the evolution of consciousness. And then I want to borrow from David Bohm. And if you'd look here at the bottom with me, and I'm not sure how big your screen is, but here's what he said. He said, people are not aware of thought as a process. It's a process. He says, rather, they are only aware of it as a content. So we're interested in the content of a dialogue, not necessarily the process. So he says we should be aware of the flow of thought as we're aware of the running of water. So he's looking here at the flow of the water. He's not looking at the riverbanks. The riverbanks they're solid. He's looking at the flow. So that's one way I think we could really start to look differently at dialogue. So I'm going to say then, I put this all together, that dialogue is a process just like thought that has an inherent dynamic of its own. It has its own DNA. It has its own inner pattern that guides it. And I think if we can begin articulating that, we can participate in a whole different way. So that's what I'd like to share with you then, is the inherent dynamic of thought, or I'm sorry, of dialogue. Here's a couple of really big proposals. I love it when David Bohm doesn't talk as if he's found the ultimate truth. He talks in proposals. So here are a couple of mine. I say that dialogue is a pattern that's been active with us since the beginning. So no one invented it. It's been with us. It's part of our design specifications. And in fact, we all know this pattern because we came into this world through it. So it's something that's not only inherent in thinking and thought, but this was our earliest experience. And even if we've forgotten about it or don't remember it, it's still there and it's awaiting our making it apparent and playing with it again. Now, one of the things I saw too, I didn't know what was going to come out of this when I started this process. And I was very surprised to see that the pattern I think is dialogue at least thus far, shows up in a lot of other places. Look at the I Ching, or think about wisdom teachings, or creation stories, or mythologies. And one of them I really love is Christopher Alexander, if you're familiar with him. Christopher Alexander is an incredible architect, and he talks about the qualities that make human structures, buildings. Sometimes you can go into building, you know, if you go to that circular fountain in Pari, that's right by where the post office is, that place is alive. What is that? Christopher Alexander says it's a quality that has no name. And to some degree, I think of that a lot like dialogue. A dialogue can be that quality that has no name. So then I want you to delve in with me into this quality that has no name. I had a real hard time trying to think how to synthesize this vast amount of information that's there and make it simple enough, or put some categories together in a way that I could describe it for you. I'm borrowing here from the idea of what we see in the sky when we look at a constellation. So you can see that there's stars that are connected. And what I'm going to try to do is pull out clumps of information that hang together and consider those like little stars. And I'm going to build a picture for you that has a bunch of stars in it, like the constellation, and try to connect them for you so that we actually create a picture that is a storage place for this pattern that wants to display itself about dialogue. So I'll stop every now and then in what I share with you and start drawing a picture so that we can keep track of these various ideas that come about. Now, there's two big metaphors that these five folks seem to use. Now, in the first case, there's three of them. This is Burrow, Foltz, and Damare who are talking. They use a lot of maternal references. They go back to the idea of the energy of the feminine archetype. So those three use those, and it's really useful to us here. Now, all five of them take a real historical picture, and particularly an anthropological picture. And so that's where I would like to start. And then you'll see the maternal weave in here. So first, let me go to a picture, a very busy picture. And so I want you to start here with me. We're going to hear some from Burrow and Barfield, but I want to start with this picture of the infant and the mother. That picture is so precious. It's just so precious. So what Barfield would tell us is this sense of wholeness that we all seem to want to reinstitute for ourselves. It shows up in our philosophies, in our religions, in our personal endeavors and prayers. We all want to go back to a sense of wholeness. And what he's telling us is that we all know this because that's how this is where we came from. Now, he talks about there having been pre-consciousness, even in the prenatal phases, that even at those early times and in the early childhood days, the infancy days like this, there's an awareness of the wholeness in which we are a part. I don't know if even you're right to say we're a part, the wholeness of which we are in unity with. So the baby doesn't know that it's separate from its mother when it's born. And so it's this early phase that I think really helps us describe what it is that David Bohm was looking for in wholeness, what dialogue is looking for to help us go back to. So I'm going to read this part real briefly. And the reason I want to do that is I get so caught up in this slide that I'll be here in 30 minutes if I don't read it and try to discipline myself. So this is part of my writing about these two characters, and I'm going to read it relatively quickly so that I don't get too stuck. I think it's such a beautiful picture. I can stay here forever. But what Burrow would say to us is, at the dawn of human existence, that is, at the earliest point in the evolution of human consciousness, we had not yet encountered our current form of self-consciousness, language, personal ego, or even thinking. Can you imagine that? How do we imagine that without thinking? Well, what's the infant doing here? The infant isn't thinking. So that's where he takes us back to feel again that kind of sense that would have been there in this wholeness. So rather than those ways that we tend to confront ourselves in our world, he says, rather, we were members of an extended family or a band of people, a tribe or something. And one thing that was common was the external environment for us. So the sun was there, the clouds were there, the rivers, the animals, whatever, all those were external there to us. It was all the same for us. But not only that, we were all built off the same design. We had the same physiology. And so as we encountered those things in the external environment, we all had the same equipment to make sense of them, to feel them. So we experienced the sun's rays as feeling warm. We experienced the flow of the river by stepping in it and feeling it move all across our legs or our body. So there's both this external and there's this internal capacity to feel, and that was all common. So that meant that these early people moved and ate and eliminated and slept. They all slept in the same sense of commonness. And that's what Thoreau would call the species solidarity. And you see here, he goes as far as he says, man is not an individual. His mentation is not individualistic. Rather, the social group, the species, is a fundamental unit. Well, wow, does that counteract our thinking? So back then, he says that was so in the early dawn. It's still true. Now, there's something really important about this, though, and it's this idea of feeling and sensation. So as by virtue of our sensory organs, that we were able to receive the stimuli of the environment and the other persons around us. So our basic capacity to experience wholeness comes from our ability to feel, to sense. Now, very much later, you can see that Thoreau or David Bohm talk about proprioception and the need to proprioceive. But at this point, he's talking about the very earliest sense. So he says, life is as it is felt. Feeling is life's reality. Now, this is what we want to come back to later. So again, there's attention and co-tension. And Thoreau was very interested in the human mind's capacity of focusing its attention in different ways. And he said, if we're doing this, if we're in this sense of species solidarity or wholeness, and if our sensing and feeling is really active, then what happens is we have a particular state of mind, a particular state of attention. He called it co-tension. And that meant attention together with. And so it was a communal sense of attention. And I think if you think about dialogue and what we hope to achieve there, there's also the sense of wanting to come into thinking together. So that's early origins there. Now let's switch to Barfield. Much of what he said was very similar, and I haven't yet found in my research a link between these two, but I swear there's one there. And I swear if there is, I'm going to find it one day. So that's running a point of real curiosity left for me now. So Thoreau says many similar things about the direct perception, that we weren't external to these others, we're all in it together. And so I tried to draw this picture. This might be this vague sensing of me, but there's this direct perception going on with everything else. And so what's flowing here in any of these descriptions, what's flowing is a direct awareness of the meaning of something. It didn't take thought to think about what the meaning of rain is or the meaning of sunshine. That comes directly through our sensory apparatus. So again, Barfield is saying something very similar. But now he says something different, and it's really interesting. And it'll come back to us in a bit. So he says that there is not only this direct awareness, but there were other beings that were there with us at the time. Now, these would have been beings, he called them figures because there isn't a good name for them. There wasn't one category of them, But there are other figures who are living, breathing, moving, interacting beings that were there right with us. Now they could have been all sorts of things, but they were there cohabitating, and they were equally the other participants in the sense of unity. Now, one category he gives is that of either spirits or gods. It wasn't the God, it was gods. So the gods weren't way up there in the sky. They were right there with us. We could commune with them just as we would with a bird in the sky or a lizard or whatever. We were all there equal. We were all there equally, and we were all participating together. There was no separation. So every now and then after I speak a little bit, I'm going to stop and say, here are the key aspects and a title I'm going to give to this clump. So you can see here, I'm going to call this holistic feminine. Now, again, I'm not talking about the gender feminine. I'm talking about the energy feminine. And these would be the characteristics of the holistic feminine kind of energy. So species solidarity, wholeness, full participation, direct perception, experiencing, sensing, feeling, co-tension, equity. Now, again, I'm going to try to make a picture for you like the constellation. So I'm trying to say, okay, there's a star that I've noticed, and put it in a picture that I can start sharing with you. So I couldn't get all those subcategories onto this picture. So I'll have to hope that you can kind of hold them in mind. But here we have the holistic feminine. And it's in a field of some kind. There's some kind of a container which is holding this all, which I can't tell you what that is exactly, but there's some kind of unity that's being held within it. Now, I came against a big surprise, a really big surprise. And that is, I couldn't explain this or the rest of the picture I want to draw unless I brought in polarity. I think that all of these 5 people in one way or another talk about a polarity. I tried to show that with that target practice picture. There's always self in relationship to something else. And so that's kind of a real basic idea about what polarity is. So I'm saying polarity was an energy that was running in the background way throughout this field, but it's also a force, an energy, a very creative energy that's going to work within each of these little bars, these bubbles or stars that I described for you. So there's something that was so essential about this idea about polarity that I had to kind of stop myself and say, what is this? Why is this so essential? So I'll give you my first couple of shots at this, and then I'm going to ask for Lee and Mark to help me out with some of this, because I think they have broader perspectives than I have. So first of all, where does it come from? So if you go back here, remember I have this little dotted circle that is surrounding what I said was the container or the field. Well, what's generating this idea of polarity? Where's it coming from? And I can't explain, I couldn't make this fit together, nor do I think these others do, unless there's someplace it comes from. So I want to use this dotted circle in this diagram I'm trying to go for you. I'm going to use that to describe what is the undescribable. So some people would call this the void, chaos, totality. David Bohm liked to talk about intelligence, the universe. And I really like this quote. So in this quote, he's talking about intelligence and material processes, you could say mind and body, as 2 separate. So actually they are right there, a polarity. So he says, intelligence and material processes have thus a single origin, which is ultimately the undetermined and unknown totality of the universal flux. So wow, David Bohm, I told you he's going to take us to the cosmos. Here we go. So here we are way out there then saying, and this is my assertion, that polarity is actually a function of the cosmos, is a function of the universal flux. And it's an energy, a very creative, powerful energy that infuses everything that's in this field that I'm going to describe to you, and everything that's in this inner dynamic of dialogue. So I'm going to stop there for just a moment. I'm going to ask if my friends Mark and Lee can come in. I think it's so important that we understand this issue of polarity a bit better than I am able to describe it. I'm wondering if the two of you would be able to help us with some understanding about polarity. And I'm going to say, Mark, maybe you could start us off and say, tell us some about polarity. And Mark, you're still muted.
There we go. Thank you, Beth. First of all, I want to commend your construction of the lineage. You're obviously on a very authentic personal quest here and trying to see how this dynamic works, the dialogue works. And it's my prejudices as an historian, I think, but your effort to trace a lineage there, I think, is a profound way of doing that. And often what you discover in the process is that these ideas were pretty pervasive at any given time. You know, we often think of a lineage as passing from one person to another pretty directly, but and that can be true, but often it's a more complicated dynamic in which somebody in the lineage becomes a symbol for somebody else on a particular aspect of it that's in the zeitgeist, as you said earlier. Now, when we think about polarity in particular, well, that's of course a very broad category. And I think of maybe 3 or so ways that come to my mind to start with about what different postures towards a polarity. You defined it there somewhere, I think, as a conflict or a tension between two elements that are seen as opposite. And one way is, one posture is to identify with one side of the pole and disparage the other. You know, so we might have good and evil, for example. Most of us would want to identify with the good and trample on the evil. That's one way of looking at a polarity. Another would be to see them as complementary. Like you have masculine and feminine, yin and yang. They're seen as together making up some kind of a harmony that composes the whole system. And then the third way, I think, is to focus on development and to see them producing some kind of a third thing, a synthesis. So if you have a more Hegelian notion of thesis, antithesis, and then a synthesis. So those are just 3 where the temporary endpoint is some kind of a new construction that takes advantage of both. So I guess a question I would have is what kind of a posture do these different figures have? There seems to be something of that conflict in the co-tension and ditension in Barreau, that ditension is not so good. Co-tension is, but there's I think there's an implicit movement in some of these polarities that you've just begun to glance at here, where it's going somewhere else. So then besides those categories of polarities, I think the thing to look for is what is that energy between them? Where does that, how do they portray the dynamic of these two poles? And then where is that leading? Is that moving somewhere? Is there a telos? Is there an endpoint to that tension between the two? If there's an emphasis particularly on history and evolution. So those are just, I think, to start us off, a few suggestions about what to look for as we focus in on poles and polarities. I'll stop there and make room for Lee's wisdom.
Thank you, Mark. I too would echo Mark's first point that I can't really begin to say how much I've learned about David Bohm through this work that Beth is doing here and what's to come also in the rest of her presentation. And that in itself, to me, is so welcome to get new ways of thinking about Bohm. And then, of course, as Beth is opening this, new and deeper ways to think about dialogue and how that unfolds and what Beth's vision of that is, I really think is extraordinary, and that it will carry us into the future, into new ways of working with all of this material. So I'm really so appreciative of that. Okay, polarity. Maybe if it's okay, I'll focus a little specifically on a little bit of how I understand Owen Barfield's notions of polarity, which are somewhat odd and somewhat difficult to penetrate, as he himself said, but because I think that version of polarity is integral to Beth's vision here, I would like to just draw that out a little bit. And as with so many things Barfieldian, it really goes back to poetry. And when he was a very young man, he read a certain line in a certain poem, and he had what he calls a felt change of consciousness. So this runs through all of his work, this felt change of consciousness. And one of the things Barfield said about polarity is it's not just an idea, but it is an imagination. In his way of talking about it, he wasn't trying to refute other ways, but offering a somewhat different way. So that polarity is an imagination. This is strange. What does that mean? So then another term we have to bring in, once you bring in the imagination, you're bringing in participation. So all this is rolled up together in Barfield. And I like to just give maybe a little image of how I found it useful to work with this image when trying to keep returning to maybe what Barfield was hinting at. And it has to do with the Earth and the Sun. So if you think of the Earth and the Sun in the way that we normally do, we're here on Earth and the Sun is some distance from us, and there's obviously interactions. We're not completely separate. But one of those interactions that we don't think about that often is the simultaneous centrifugal and centripetal forces that hold the Earth in revolution around the Sun. So these forces, it's these two apparently opposing forces that are central to what Barfield was trying to talk about with polarity. And I can kind of hear him say, if he were listening, so far so good. Yes, those forces are part of polarity as I mean it. But the way you're talking about those forces, you're using the collective representations of mechanism, right? So it's like the atomistic, the Earth is held in movement around the sun by these two polar forces. And he says, that is distinctly not what I'm talking about. You have to go further. And in order to go further, you do have to develop a different kind of imagination to consider what could those forces be if they're not mechanical. You see, this is what Barfield was trying to urge us to imagine into. It gets underneath the normal mechanical way that we would represent the Earth's relation to the sun. Well, what's the result of that kind of imagination? There's only one way to do that, and that is to do it yourself, right? It's not like it's laid out what happens if you do that, because Barfield wants us to participate in this and not just to think about it. So if I can, just one other image that goes along with that. Again, with the Earth and Sun, we normally think of ourselves as here and there. We're here, the sun is there. And in one way, that's true. But in another way, if you think of the solar wind and the total projection of the sun and its radiance, if you were to back away with a right kind of satellite, telescope, or whatever, at some point, the Earth would disappear into the radiance of the sun, and as would all of the other planets. And so what you would have is just this unity of Earth and sun. But that's not a perspective that we normally work with. So I think in a Barfield way of thinking of polarity, there's this question of being both one and different at the same time. This is central in his work with polarity, a unity and an individuality at the same time. So if we exercise our imagination and think of the Earth as being so enveloped in the solar wind and the radiance of the sun that the planets are really more like cells within the sun rather than these separate atomistic parts. And so then again, you would ask, even if we think of them as cells within the sun, there's still a semi-mechanical aspect to that. How would you imagine it not being mechanical? So I would like to read one little bit, Barfield on polarity, quoting Coleridge. He says, grant me a nature having two contrary forces, the one of which tends to expand infinitely, while the other strives to apprehend or find itself within this infinity. Show me those two forces, and I will cause the whole world of intelligences with the whole system of their representations to rise up before you. So I think there's just something really very tantalizing and potent when we fold into everything we've been hearing so far, these Barfieldian notions of polarity. Thank you.
Thank you both. Well, I could just sit, Lee, and let that soak. And Mark, think about which orientation we're going to take. I could just soak on that for a long time. And I want to tell you all how incredible it's been to have these two to work with me this summer. They have been such wonderful partners and helping me get at least to where I am. Now, I'm not with Barfield. I can't go there yet, but it's certainly part of the stretch I would like to be able to make. And I think what I hear from this also is, I don't know that we're ever going to finish this kind of a query or this kind of a quest. It is one we have to take individually, and it goes on forever. It's not one that we can ever finish and truly get our arms around. It's ongoing. Now, I am, however, going to shift our gears and go back to where we were, and whoops, I've lost my place here. Hold on. Hold on. Okay. So, given my smaller understanding or capacity with polarity, and hopefully incorporating and giving space for the various views that Mark and Lee have shared, this is the way that I'm picturing it. It's a very primitive picture, and it does take a bit from Barfield, because this is one of the descriptions he gives. He says that polarity is two counteracting and correlative forces that have separated themselves, forming two poles. I think that's a really temporary definition. I mean, I think the idea of polarity is taking a moment in time. Things separate, they also come back together, or they morph. And so this is a very temporary, tentative kind of a description, but let's push it further. Whoops, I am going the wrong direction. I'm still going the wrong direction. So if we were going to look then at this picture of the holistic feminine energy here, if we're going to look here and we were going to say, then, how does polarity work here? I said the polarities in the field, it's also in each of these bubbles, these constellations I'm trying to share with you. What we have then is something that's polarizing within the holistic feminine. Now, if you're actually in a dialogue, here's how that might feel. A lot of times we're in a dialogue, and it's a new group particularly, people start out being really nice. They're kind of contained within the structure that we have. There is this sense of wanting to be whole. We don't want to make any waves. We want harmony, those kinds of characteristics. But then if somebody offers an idea of a different nature, doesn't quite fit that overall picture, what does that feel like? That's the kind of tension or the kind of feeling that I think we can get as we apply these ideas to dialogue. So let me show you what that other part might be. What's the tension we might be feeling? So I like to think here a bit from the Jungian perspective. What's the shadow side of the holistic feminine? And here's the way I've described it. Now, this comes from a Jungian analyst whose name is Gareth Hill, who's absolutely fabulous. And he wrote a book called Masculine and Feminine, The Natural Flow of Opposites in the Psyche. So this really comes from Gareth Hill's work. And I was really fortunate to have a little bit of time to work with him. So here are the characteristics that are in opposition or in complementarity with what I already described. Well, there's inertia because of the constancy. There's no space for change in this first picture. So there's smothering entanglement. We can't really escape this wholeness. There's no room for shifting. There's possessiveness. There's a duty that takes prominence over the individual. So all is for the sake of the whole, not for the individual. And there isn't really individuality there. So in a dialogue, when somebody voices another opinion, maybe that doesn't fit here. And one of the ways you'll see this show up in a dialogue is if this is really going on, what you'll start to see is attrition in your dialogue group. Because some people who feel like they are so smothered by the existing kind of predominant personality that's developing within the group, there isn't room for their ideas. And so quite often these people will just drop. Well, so what else comes about here? Now, I'm going to suggest that we don't really know the source of it. I think that we could say that it's the void out here, void clear out here. Maybe that's what generates this. But at any rate, something comes about that creates the overall complement to the holistic feminine. And we'll call it the individualistic masculine. So again, this is energy, not gender. Well, what does that look like? So we began with all of these characteristics of the holistic feminine. And then what happens because of the tension that's been going on? Well, we have the individualistic masculine. There's individuality. This sounds pretty good. There's individuality. We're no longer smothered. There's separateness. Oh, language. You know, remember that both Barfield and Burroughs say this is before a lot of this mental processing was even available to humankind. So there's language, symbolic processing. There's thought and assumptions. Oh, wait a minute. We lost cotention. Where'd cotention go? Well, it becomes split attention, ditension. We have authority. We have hierarchy. We have science and technology. And wow, look at the benefits that we got from that. That's really immense. So there wasn't much room for the evolution of consciousness before. It really took this splitting, give that to us. So what have we got? Well, maybe this was all necessary and inevitable, because this is what gave us the capacity of rational thought, technology, science, discoveries, etc. Really valuable. Where would we be without that? Really valuable. Now, but given this whole issue of complementary or opposite parts of the polar structure, what else do we get? What was the cost here? Well, remember that Barfield said in that original participation, we were right with the gods. We were directly participating with them. That's one of the things that got lost here. We no longer, because we don't any longer have the direct perception. We've lost this capacity of even as Burroughs said, we've lost this sensory connection with the whole. What have we got? Well, we've lost connection with the gods. So then I call this much like the expulsion from the Garden of Eden. Now, how is that? Well, Adam and Eve were back there in the original participation. They had full direct experience. They didn't need anything to mediate meaning. They got it directly. But what about now? Well, now we've got language, symbolization, selfhood. That intermediates between us and the environment. So that's one of the downsides. We lost the direct connection. Now, but Barfield says, wow, if the primary balance of the species solidarity is disrupted, then everything else is as well. So he calls this now ditension, split attention. And that means that he says things like disintegration, disorder, disease. Those are the things that start to come about. And there's so much overemphasis on self and separation that this is the description he gives. He calls it the I persona. We develop what's called the I persona. And he says that's a supreme, isolated, unique, partitive self. He loves that word, partitive. Partitive self that operates as a separate and autocratic center of motivation. The individual becomes a principal, a private principality, separate from every other. He went so far as to say that we've gone so far over on that polar edge that the whole society now has become neurotic. It's not just people with mental illness that have problems, the whole society is there. And so what do? Well, this is the picture we've created. There's been a polarity that has invested itself within the individualistic masculine. And there's a piece that Bohm too wants to add in here, I think. What is this dark side? He calls it, along with, I understand this comes from his work with Krishnamurti, he calls it thought pollution. And the thought pollution creates a big cloud that he calls the sorrow of mankind. Now, what he's telling us is in our fragmented thought, not our fragmented thinking, but our fragmented thought, our fragmented memory system, that what happens is individually, we're creating thought pollution that goes up to the non-manifest conscious of mankind as a whole. We're creating a huge cloud of thought pollution. He calls it the sorrow of mankind. So this thought pollution, because we're re-enfolding back to the implicate, it's forming this cumulative cloud that then re-enfolds to us. We work it more and make it worse, and we re-enfold it back again. And it's this recurring cycle of thought pollution. So this is pretty serious. This is pretty serious. Well, so here I tried to draw this on our picture as this gray cloud that's beginning to form. It's not directly in the individualistic masculine, because Bohm's telling it's moving over into this unmanifest human consciousness realm. Now, there's something that starts happening though. Now, these two bubbles, they've got a lot of polarity going on between them. There's a lot of energy going on between them. And I was thinking here right now, because I live close to the Gulf of Mexico, I'm always very, very attentive to polar turbulences, climate turbulences that occur in places called the Leeward Islands or in the Bahamas. So when there's a big turbulence that happens, what do we get? A hurricane. And guess what? Mark and I, both living close to the coast, we're both watching Hurricane Ida form. And for a while, we weren't sure if it was going to come to Houston. And as it turns out, it's not us, probably. It's more like New Orleans that's going to get it. But the reason I say that is the meteorologists talk about what they call a Coriolis force. And that's the energy that starts happening when you've got these two oppositional forces working at each other, and they start to create a swirl. They create a swirl. Now, how would you feel this in a dialogue? Why am I giving you something so abstract? If you listen in a dialogue, not just to the content, but you listen to things like the prosody of people speaking, the qualities of their thought, the cadence, the amount of emotion that's coming in. If you look at the flow, we tend to like to keep it even. We like to keep it calm. We like to keep it smooth. And if in that smoothness, there's somebody that issues something that's got a lot of emotion in it, their cadence picks up really quick, they're angry, there's emotion coming through, that flow feels like it's getting disrupted. And that quick shifting quite often is an indication that there's something in play, that actually this whole dialogue could take a different direction and go much deeper. But what you'll also notice often is that quickness, that staccato, or that cadence that voice carries makes other people immediately very uncomfortable. And quite often somebody will come in right after and change it back to the peaceful, slow moving harmonic level. Well, often we miss this in a dialogue or in conversations. We miss that something's called us to move forward into this swirl. So this swirl, then I say, it's a potential turning point. It's a potential. It may not happen, but it's a potential. So here I am describing it again in my preoccupation with hurricanes. So this is what the Coriolis force looks like. It causes the circulation. But here's Bohm talking. So he wasn't talking about my weather. He's talking about other things here. So listen. So the roots of disturbances in the culture will be considered to lie within the implicate order, somewhere within the collective consciousness of mankind. This requires reversing the field disturbances by taking individual responsibility for them in order to clear up the polluted field. So we need to reverse the field disturbances in order to work this through. Well, what's that like? So I put together this bubble here that says transformation. In other places, Bohm talks about movement. You know, that's the essence of his whole work, is movement. So at some place, somebody asked him, what do you mean by movement? Is that from going from here to here? And he said, no. Movement isn't necessarily just translocation. Movement is a process of transformation. So that's kind of what we're talking about here is we're in this swirl. And if we take it up, there's some transformative processes that can come to us then. Now, one of the set of slides that I left out were the ones that go into this transformation. And I tell you about cried when I did it. I got so excited about some of these things these 5 people said. It was just really beautiful. And in interest of time, I'm going to go really quick here. But first of all, Damare. So Damare talks about dialogue as needing to occur in a container in which that transformation can occur. He's talking about here the methodology that we have in place with dialogue, so that a group, first of all, a group is a microcosm of society. And so you got all the differences, all the societal assumptions there represented, or lots of them, that we come in with a sense of listening. We come in with a sense of going for understanding. There's no agenda. There's no outcome per se. There's this latitude to allow the arising of the assumptions that we're carrying within us. So then he says that in a dialogue, it's easy for our unrecognized assumptions to be evoked. So if you're really a representative of climate change, and you've been voicing that with great emotion, as my good friend Linda would attest to, if you're really voicing that, and somebody voices another opinion that says, we don't know the science of that, what you're saying is bunk. You're really building on this in a way that's not right. Ooh, there comes to be a glitch. So it's easy for these assumptions to be evoked. That's part of the issue. A lot of our assumptions are so blocked from our awareness that we don't realize, we can't really make them conscious until we're in a situation, until we speak them, so that we hear ourselves enunciating those hidden assumptions that are within us. So that's one thing, is languaging and symbolization. You could also put some of these things in imagery, in poetry, in music, but various ways of symbolizing them so they become conscious. Well, also back to Trijant Moreau, he says there really is something hopeful here. He's kind of pointing the way for us. And again, I'm giving such short attention to what he has to say. But this early sense of wholeness that he was describing for us is still there. It's part of our design specification. It's still there. And if we can go back to this essential process of feeling, of sensing, of proprioception, and really learn to use it, that is one of the biggest hints about how to re-access a wholer state, of how to do our own personal work here. That's really critical. And I made up this term, phylic attention deficit disorder, play off of Moreau's thinking of the phylic level, the phylus. So he says that when we work on this at our own level, it also starts to build back the group, the cosmic, the species solidarity. So these are there. Our job is to re-access them, but not without a little bit of difficulty. This doesn't just come because we want it. We have to do some work with it. And as I was saying, if we're in a situation where our real prime core assumptions are being evoked, it's going to not feel all so good. It's going to be frustrating. And David Pete and David Bohm say, it has to have the heat. If what we're really up to is not just having a nice conversation in a dialogue, but if we're really going to work on the level of societal assumptions, it's going to take heat to melt through them. So it's the frustration and its heat that unfreezes our thinking so that it can get cleaned up. We can put these things in consciousness so that we can actually work with them. So they said too, that the real key here is holding the attention. Now, what does that mean? It means that it's there, we feel it, we don't try to push it away. We don't try to fix it. What we don't realize is most of these emotions have their own little short life cycle. And if we can just hold them for a while, they'll work themselves through and they'll make a display then for us of what is underneath them. What's the meaning of this assumption? What's the meaning of the frustration? we were experiencing. So that, again, we get it in consciousness. So these are some of those aspects then of what comes up in what I've called the transformation stage. But I wanted to point out something that Damare said that was really, really critical. And this is something I'm going to tell you that is clearly not finished in my mind and my sharing it with you. But I think it's really the hint of someplace where we need to do some work. So Damare talks about frustration and its necessity. And the reason it's so necessary is what can happen here. We've talked about these polar opposites. Well, what happens is there's a point at which these polar opposites cross each other. There's an intersection point. Now, this is the part that is the most powerful and that I can least explain. Lots more work for all of us to do here. But it's at this point that we might call it the nexus, is what I've described it as. The nexus that will come about when these polarities come together and meet each other. Now, here's Damare's description. So Lee was talking about there being potentially two opposites or complementary forces. And sometimes there's an idea of a third force or something that wants to come through. Damare represents, now differently than I think that Barfield would say, he represents there being a third function that goes on here, a third force. So what he says is we've got mind with a big M. Mind with a big M is the source of the whole. And so I've suggested that we connect it to this, this dotted circle I have created, that it's the void, it's the flux. So the third would be the mind with a big M would be that. And then we've got little m's, mind with a little m. That's us little guys down here. When we get into polar situations with other people, or it could even be polar situations within ourselves, what happens is the function of mind with a big M would be to intervene there and bring the energy, to bring the process by which those differences intermingle and interpenetrate each other. So he says there's a coherent third state that brings about transformation and evolution. I've tried to come up with an image because many times when I can't speak something well, if I can find an image, it helps at least give the energy for this. So this is one of the reunion of soul and body. Now, does this actually happen in dialogue? And I say, yeah, sometimes it happens and we miss it. Sometimes it passes by and we don't enter into it at all. So it doesn't always happen. When it does, though, my experience has been there's probably been some tension in the group. We don't understand the tension. And so there's a sense of frustration that comes. But sometimes in that frustration, the groups get stuck and they're silent for a bit. It's like, what do we do with this? We don't understand what's going on. I don't know how to get out of this thought. And then there was a guy in one of my dialogues one time who we were much in that state. And he said, after we'd sat there for a while in silence and tension, he said, I have no idea why I'm going to say what I'm going to say. And then out of his mouth came something that was an articulation of the meaning of that polarity, that the meaning that we weren't seeing, that it took both sides to be able to articulate. That might be what Mark was referring to as the teleological sense of it. There was something that emerged from that wasn't there before, that came about that was so special, so wonderful. There's a numinosity that happens at that point. There's a sparkliness that comes to the group. And so even though sometimes we're not equipped to realize that it's possible or that it's there, it might pass by, that would be a really special point. And again, I'm not being as articulate as I want to be. This is something for a lot more research. But so here we have it. I've shown you the dialogue's nexus there with the two arrows coming together, but there's an implication there. You know, again, back to Mark's idea that something evolves from this, perhaps. I say there is an emergence. And I call this a regeneration phase. And so that made me think of Deucalion and his wife, who were the survivors of a huge cataclysmic event. They were sole survivors. They asked the gods how to regenerate mankind, and were told to throw the bones of the mother over their shoulders. And they did that. And so then regenerated humankind. Well, in dialogue, we're not really engendering again the whole of humankind, but we're trying to engender a new way of being together, a new way of thinking together. And so again, let's go to Damare. And he says, as a consequence of minds intermingling, new meaning is made, meaning that's more freely based on reflectiveness, choice, focusing, minding, grace, and beauty. Now, in contrast to the sorrow of mankind, I'll say, I'll take that. I'd like some of that. I'd like some of that. But Bohm, he's not going to let us rest there. Leave it to Bohm. He's going to say there's more. Now, he says we have to do our own work. Granted, we have to do our work. We have to unpollute our thought. But what if we had a whole group of people who were doing that, who were working together to do that? Then what would be possible? So he says if people were to think together in a coherent way, as in a dialogue situation, it would have tremendous power. In a true dialogue, there is a possibility that a new form of consensual mind forms. When consciousness is one, when it's acting as one, the collectively shared meaning is very powerful, more powerful than the individual thought. So you can see here then his participative thought coming to the fore. So we have to do our own work, more power when we work with others who are also doing their own work. Now there is an obstacle. That obstacle is if we really do that work, if we really work through our deeply held personal assumptions, our deeply held societal assumptions, it's going to change our identity. We will have given up some of the core attributes that we think of ourselves as being. My identity's on the stake. Well, I see people in dialogues get about this far. They see the prospect that there's going to be change in their self-identity. And they say, no, I don't think I want to go there. It's too much. That's too much to ask for me. So that's a real possibility. And there really is another one. And that is kind of very much related. And as we get the idea of it, and we believe it, but we still can't give up our self-identity. So we think we're doing it, but we're talking about it. We're not doing it. There was a use of words, and Lee, I hope I didn't get this wrong, but there was some place in Barfield's writing where I read that we aren't really wanting to participate with. That's not the idea, because that assumes we're external. We're participating with. What we need to do is participate the flow. We are the participator. We're the one that does it. We're not looking from the outside in. We're doing it. We're taking on this new identity. And I think that's really a powerful word when we put it in that context. So what we have then is in this regeneration phase, we've got new identity that's coming from our individual responsibility of cleaning up our polluted thought. And that then leads us into the possibility of participative thought. And Damare would say that's like a butterfly. The caterpillar has become a butterfly. It's a really big total transformation. So here's what it looks like. This picture I've been trying to draw. You'd think that would be it. But wouldn't you know it? David Bohm's going to come back in here. He ain't going to let us rest yet. So what did he say? There are three basic levels: the individual, the collective or the socio-cultural, and the cosmic. And we've been doing some pretty good work on the individual and socio-cultural. But he says, no, you got to go further. You got to bring in the cosmic. Here are just 3 quotes from On Dialogue where he talks about this. He says, first of all, Such participation goes on to a greater collective mind, and perhaps ultimately to some yet more comprehensive mind and principle, capable of going indefinitely beyond even the human species as a whole. He's going to go even beyond Burrow. Possibly it could make a new change in the individual and a change in relation to the cosmic. So the idea of partaking of the whole and taking part in it, not merely the whole group, but the whole. The whole. Well, here's a couple snips out of a conversation of Bohm and Renee Weber that I think are just precious, but I think it puts the cap on this. So Weber says to Bohm, all this suggests not only that we transform as eternity unfolds in us, but also that eternity may transform as it returns to itself in a richer way through our participation. Wow. Yes, says Bohm. Yes, we have at least the potential to participate. Yes, we may participate in the whole and thus help give it meaning. We are an intrinsic feature of the universe, which would be incomplete without us in some fundamental way. Now, I can't think of any loftier picture of the potential for humankind, for dialogue, than that. I can't think of anything to go beyond that, other than one last picture. And that is, I think Bohm says one other thing. I think he says that the participation that's going on here is reciprocal. So I've tried to draw this arrow. Here we have these issues down at the bottom in the new identity phase. That's us down here participating with the void, with the intelligence of the universe, with the universal flux. That we are in a reciprocal relationship where we affect each other, and that we are part of the vital part of that transformation. So I'm going to turn off the screen share, give my two buddies a chance to breathe for a moment, and then say, where would you go with this? Now, I have to tell you, these guys knew what I was going to say. I don't know what they're going to say. So I just want to say welcome to whatever it is that you would wish to share for a bit. And then after that, we'll open up to the group. So whichever you wishes to go.
Well, I'll chime in with something here, Beth. I'm coming to this with a background in transpersonal psychology. And it's of interest to me that all of the people in your lineage, with Barfield accepted, are psychologists involved in depth psychology in the earlier part of the 20th century, when a lot of these ideas were coming to the fore about what that told us about the human psyche. So I'm seeing the dialogue as one of various different processes identified at that time that all reflect a similar kind of pattern. You mentioned we go from wholeness to expulsion to sorrow associated with that, and the disturbances, the heat, the frustration. And but then that leads to some kind of a transformation that brings about a sense of meaning that reconnects to some degree with a wholeness. It reflects maybe a different kind of whole than we started from, but there's a new wholeness emerging. And I see that pattern as quite universal. Once you get into a certain level of depth in the unconscious, that patterning, I'd say, almost naturally emerges. It is, for example, quite close to the hero's journey in the mythologies that Joseph Campbell had spoken of, the monomyth as he identifies it. There's much of that same kind of trajectory. It's a trajectory that's probably repeated in rites of passage in indigenous society. So there are various other kinds of rituals that one can go through to help bring us to that depth of, into the unconscious, where that kind of patterning emerges. I think David Bohm himself thought in those terms. I did notice the comment that he says that deep down in the unconscious, this participatory thinking may be part of us all, and that it reaches towards the cosmic. Okay. Now, there'd be a lot of ways you could discuss these kind of parallels, but I'll just limit some remarks to one, and that's the work of the Czech-American psychologist Stanislav Grof, who sees this very similar pattern that's built into our incarnation in the birth process itself. So he goes through a similar kind of trajectory and sees it as stages of birth. We have an initial stage in which there's a connection with the wholeness, is when the fetus is in the womb, totally connected with the mother in a very harmonious sort of way under normal circumstances. And then there's a sudden onset of contractions, which is like the expulsion from the Garden of Eden. And there you hit a sense of the real sorrow, because there's a sense of escape in that phase. But then as the fetus begins to enter the birth canal, it becomes a question of struggle, of heat, you call it heat and frustration, as you go through a process where there seems to be a goal emerging, as there was not in the second stage of pure sorrow. There's a sense that there's a place to go somehow. And then this can involve a tremendous struggle, but then it comes out to the liberation of birth itself and the reconnection with, or a connection, a regeneration, to use your term. And that you can see that patterning in a lot of different basic mythologies. You take the Christian version of going from the wholeness of Eden, the expulsion from the Garden of Eden, and then the long time prior to the arrival of Christ, where we've seen as being lost in this struggle. And then the whole thing is more or less projected on the figure of Christ, and we have the passion, the great struggle, and then the resurrection, right? So it's that, my suggestion here is that there's dialogue is one way. You and I have some familiarity with the process of holotropic breath work, which is another way of doing it, but it's entering into that level of depth of the unconscious where we see this dynamic. I'm tempted to call it universal, but in any case, we see this dynamic emerging in many different experiences and societies. So there's there in which I think the dialogue is participating in this something of a discovery of depth psychology that's, that indicates that this patterning is sort of a fundamental part of our story. And I'd even add in these, what often seem like dismal times, that this is a rather optimistic view of where the story goes. There's a sense that there's an intelligence built into the cosmos and into us ourselves that gives some of the sense of darkness that we're facing now a meaning, a recognition of the Jungian shadow, let's say, and that out of that can come a regeneration. And for myself, I haven't given up on that as a fundamental dynamic of what we as a species are going through at this time.
Right. Lee, want to add in there?
May I? Number, I'm getting, okay. Sorry, there was some sound issue here. A number of things that Mark has woven in, all of it in some way having to do with a feeling of myth, like the whole birth process as a kind of mythic activity. And then Mark also referenced different mythologies that reflect some of the themes that you brought out, Beth. So what's really interesting to me in thinking about it that way is whether or not we can enter this process as a living myth, right? Be in it as participants in a living myth. So, Mark, when you were bringing out these aspects, I think that's very helpful and gives us some really good indicators. Now, part of that, Beth, earlier you had mentioned that, like I think most of the rest of us that have worked with these presentations, you had to carve things out, and it wasn't fun and it wasn't easy. And one of the things that I know was somewhat more strongly emphasized in some of your earlier versions of this, and it's a little below the surface today, but I would love it if you would say a little more about the sensibility of, in this case, dialogue, in some sense, having a consciousness of its own, and that it's kind of drawing in these people in this lineage to help it further whatever its own evolution is, so that you have this ongoing polarity between these individuals in interaction with this kind of overarching quasi-independent consciousness of dialogue itself, or something like that. If you would maybe bring in a little more of that.
Sure. Oh, yeah, that is a really big theme, really big. I think it starts largely with Michael Folks, and he talks about the formation of what he calls a matrix within the group. So there's a formation of wholeness that begins even when the group is first starting. And if the group stays together and really works it, that he says it starts to be a case where individuals aren't speaking on their own behalf. They're speaking on behalf of the group, but that the group itself, the formation of the group, that's my earphone, the formation of the group has its own mind. It's as if there's a mind that's growing within it or that's attaching there that is intentional and willful. Now, that was what really started me thinking about this. But it also, you know, it's also what I started talking about. What has attracted me in this process, or what, you know, I've told you, the two of you, sometimes I feel possessed by this. It wakes me up at 4 o'clock in the morning. It says, get up and work on this. Well, I'm not a mystic and I'm not a prophet, but there's something that has deep intention and capacity that works through us at times. I think it's very much that same kind of sense that works through the artist. So I can't remember if I said this before or not. Hester talked about imagination as being able to attach to an inkling or something that wants to be put into manifestation. And that's kind of the way I think that dialogue itself is working. There's something that I really feel, and that many of these around us, Beyond, whom I didn't talk about today, but Wilfred Beyond goes directly into this. What is it? What is it that wants to speak here? What would it be that wants to give us, as Mark was saying, what wants to give us hope that this is part of the process that we might work through? Now you can take it as a religious thing, but I don't think any of these people were being particularly religious. They had experience in their own mind and learning that said, there's an intention behind dialogue. And if we really do our own work, what we're doing is taking the barriers out of our way that keep us from connecting with it. And one of those barriers then is that we participate that energy then. It's kind of that dual aspect then, that there is this energy wanting to come through. It's asking us to not look at it, it's wanting us to be it. It's like Burrow used to say, you can read a book about dancing, but if you want to dance, you're going to have to dance. You have to be the experience of it. And I think that's whatever this is asking. It wants to dance. It wants us to dance along with it. Be part of the dance, not to know about the dance, but to dance. So that's the best explanation I can give you.
Great, thank you.
So let's see, do Mark or Lee, what else would you like to add before we open it up?
I'd like. Okay. Please go ahead, Mark.
You know, another parallel that struck me as I was boning up on dialogue was that and as I've listened to some of the comments in previous sessions of this conference, is some of the parallels with Buddhism, particularly it seems to me that much of the dialogue is an application of mindfulness principles to thought itself. You just watch it, you give full attention to it, you don't get hooked up in the content, you see you step back and see it's just observe it. And in that way, get to a deeper level. And even in the Theravedic approach towards mindful or Vipassana meditation, they speak of the 4 foundations of mindfulness, and they're quite close to things that Bohm mentioned in terms of first of all, the first foundation of mindfulness is the body. When he talked about proprioception, you have that almost physical sense of that's where you start. And then it goes through feeling tones, and Bohm emphasized that a great deal. you can feel your way into these thoughts rather than analyzing them. And then mind is, well, I don't want to get too far into this, but there's mind and there's dharma, but there seem to be quite some parallels there between that approach towards mindfulness and the way Bohm wants us to approach thought in dialogue. That's a tangent that probably we don't need to run with, but it's just another parallel that came to my mind as I was reading through this material.
Well, to pick up on what Mark has just said about mindfulness and other kinds of approaches to being able to work with these contemplations. The last time that I ever talked to David Bohm, one of the things that he brought up was that he was feeling, that the dialogue groups really weren't actually not working very well, that they seemed to do okay here and there, and then they would falter. And I asked him, why do you think that's happening? And right away he said, I don't think people are doing enough work on their own, which is very intriguing because, of course, dialogue ostensibly, in one slice of it at least, is a collective process, almost by definition. And here he was saying, well, people need to be working on their own. And I think some of what he was indicating there was, if we just come to dialogue and expect it to do something for us, maybe certain things will happen, but the whole process will be potentized and elevated and more highly charged if we really keep sustaining attention to the questions that are involved with this whole dialogue process. If we engage with those questions when we're not in the dialogue and really work with them and use these qualities of mindfulness and other such qualities to allow us to drop more and more deeply into what this process could really be. So I think he was looking for people to work both individually and collectively toward what dialogue might be able to evolve into. And let's see, there was, one other thought. In one of your slides, Beth, there was a quote from Demare about transformation from a chrysalis into a butterfly. He said, this is not about doing the same things over and over. It's actually about a transformation and not just a modification. And so to me, that's kind of at the other end of the spectrum. If we have, things that work we can do on our own practical applications of qualities of attention and mindfulness, then bringing that into the dialogue. But then to really hold in an imaginative way, what would it really mean to change consciousness that radically, not shuffling things around a little bit, a different configuration within consciousness, but that the whole structure of consciousness itself could change, like a chrysalis into a butterfly. And I can't speak for some of the people that are in the dialogue lineage, but I feel confident in saying, especially seeing this from Demare, that this is really the bottom line for Demare and Bohm and Barfield. They're really talking about a deeply fundamental transformation of consciousness and not just a kind of reorganization or taking in new concepts, but something more fundamental than that. This word transformation, I think, goes to the heart of it. So yeah, I think that's enough for now. I'll leave it at that. Thank you both.
Well, I think the universality, that really is clear. That really is clear to me, that this is an inherent pattern within us as individuals. It's inherent within us as a culture. It's really something that is fractal. This vision of wholeness is fractal for us. And I think Barreau, although I maybe didn't say it enough about it, but clearly he was right there with it. That was going back to a sense of wholeness, but yet it isn't the wholeness we knew before. So it has to have grown and become more complex. It has to have gone through this cycle many times. And so that what we would see is something new. He would say we don't get enlightened once and then it's done. We have to keep working through it over and over again. But to me, it is like Mark said, it's very hopeful that if this is inherent within us, and if we are willing to risk our old self-identity, that it's immeasurably powerful. And I'm thinking maybe we could park it here and see what our audience wants to say. And I'm going to make a particular note. I'm seeing, James, I'm seeing that Roberto Schellberger has his hand up, and he's one of the incredible teachers I have had. He worked with Damari, and I'm wondering if we could call on him first, since he's been such a special teacher to me, and see what he might have to share.
Yes, sure. Just before we open up, I'd just like to, well, first of all, thank you, Beth, for your presentation, and thank you so much, Mark and Lee, for your contributions. I am just opening up the chat now, so you'll be able to share your thoughts between participants in the chat. And just another gentle reminder that as we only have about 10 minutes left for Q&A, and we want to give as many people as possible the opportunity to ask their questions, we just ask you to keep your questions a bit more short and focused. And also, if you can reserve any follow-up questions so we get as many people in. So yeah, so with that, I'll give it to Roberto.
Yes. So thanks. Thanks, Beth, for inviting me to this very interesting lecture. I just briefly want to say something about metamorphosis from Desmarais, because it seems to imply that's not only, well, it's a conscious transformation, but even a cell transformation. It helps to develop better feeling, to be able to neurologically be able to understand. It's not only a conscious thing, it's even a cell process. That's why metamorphosis. Okay, that's all. Thanks.
Thank you, Roberto. So yeah, so thank you for that contribution, and we'll just move over now to Todd.
Oh, well, thank you. Wonderful dialogue through this and through the whole series. But just occurs to me as we're having this dialogue all across the world, this is a morphogenic field. It's increasing dialogue and dialogue with consciousness, and that forward motion, you know, each of these is a kernel, how it's expressed through that, through this particular gathering and the thoughts we take back, but through art and all creativity. And we talk about the optimism that comes with that. I do firmly believe there's a teleological purpose to the cosmos, and this is very much part of it. And toward that optimism is, you know, changing a consciousness, because I think it's the direction to which we're headed, and onward we shall. But in the short term, changing consciousness is on an individual level, but I do think we're getting close to a larger species-wide one, and that's going to be forced by climactic catastrophe. And I see that it's a proximate specter of peril, but it's also an opportunity to change the way we think of interconnectedness, because of the peril of that, and the promise of how to solve it is going to force a change, a paradigmatic change in our consciousness. And it's so wonderful to hear these dialogues, and it fills me with such optimism. That's my only observation. No further question, but thank you all.
Can I respond just briefly? Todd, thank you for that. I'm right with you. And one of the things that I think many of these people would say is that there's an issue of fractal quality that comes in. So on one hand, yes, it does require that we start with self. But as we do that, it's also giving some rise to other levels, and not only in terms of its outcome, but of the encouragement of other levels of the cosmos to also take on the process, if that makes any sense. So we're not only dealing with evolving our personal conscious, we're involved in evolving the process of consciousness and the process of growth. And so I think that's partly what you're referring to. And there's another issue there, and that is they all said that this growth, this stuff has to occur in a context. It needs a context. It can't just happen on its own. And I think one of the beautiful things about PARI, it's been the container for a lot of this dialogic thinking to have a home. It's been the container for one of the opportunities for this level of consciousness and growth and evolution to occur. And I think that's just really significant. I think there's a special place for PARI in terms of the whole growth that we're seeing occur. So thank you, Todd.
Thank you, Todd, for your question. Next question will come from Richard.
Hi, thank you so much, Beth. You opened with why does it work? Why does dialogue work? And I'm not sure you touched on that, even though we understand how it evolved. I think it works because it's a little bit like seeing a fleck of gold in a stream and wanting to collect more. That in conversation and in dialogue, we can have a moment where something beyond what's happening touches us, and we are excited to explore further. And I think it's a recognition, and it touches on a yearning for connection that we all carry with us, perhaps from exiting the birth canal as it was offered. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard, for bringing that in. Did anyone want to comment on that, or we can move on? Sorry.
Well, I think that the issue I maybe didn't make very clear, but what I was wanting to say, Richard, was it's this process of going through the flow of this activity, this flow of this, that leads us to that point of transformation. That is how dialogue works. It's working us through this energy cycle that allows for transformation. That was the intent that I was going to say. It's not a content, it's a process. Now, maybe that doesn't agree with you, or maybe I just haven't said it well, but anyway, that's what I would respond.
Thank you. Yes, so next we will go to Kyla.
Yeah, hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Hi, I just want to say, wow, I really appreciate this conversation, Beth, and your approach. And yesterday I'd asked the question about how to bridge the gap between the Western view of consciousness as arising from the gray matter of the brain, and the Eastern view of matter arising from universal consciousness, and how to bridge those two worlds. And I think this is the growth edge of the Western view of how can we reach that universal in a way that doesn't have to necessarily go religious, although even Jesus said, when two or more are present, I am there. It takes that interaction, but we also say for every action there is an equal and opposite reaction. There's so many things in science and spirituality that say similar things. And I just wanted to appreciate this conversation so much. Thank you. That's all.
Thank you very much, Kyla, for that. Next, we will go to Gary.
Hello, everyone. I really appreciated this this open conversation about the importance of dialogue. But I think it's important to recognize that there is dialogue within and there's dialogue without, right? That it begins internally. And I wanted to bring people's attention to Eric Neumann's book called Depth Psychology and the New Ethic, that we have to learn how to deal with our own shadows. Because the minute we start to project our shadows onto others, dialogue falls apart. That's where dialogue fails, I think, is when we are unable to actually see that we have that responsibility to address our own issues and do that hard work that the old ethic overlooked and that the old ethic led to basically tragedy and genocide. And, you know, I think dialogue's important, but it's also important that we recognize the ethical imperative of taking responsibility for our own selves. And that it begins with the individual and then goes to the collective. That's all I wanted to say. If anyone wants to.
James, this is Mark. Could I have just a quick comment here back to Kyla's point? I think that I noticed that Bohm says that at one point that the cosmic dimension is an essential dimension of the human being, and he goes on to say that the greater part of our experience is with the implicate, but we don't know that because that's not our focus of attention. And I think in this effort to plunge more deeply into the unconscious, that's one of those fundamental discoveries that we had so many people in the, as transpersonal psychology was being developed, who began with a rather secular stance. And then out of the experiences they were having by delving into the unconscious through psychedelic therapy, among other ways, they come across a realization that that cosmic dimension is fundamental. It's not just a product of the brain. It's something that seems a fundamental element of existence, and it's a mystical realization, but it's a realization, the potentiality of which is built into all of us, and that some of these exercises of enhancing consciousness can bring us to. And so they do merge.
Thank you, Mark.
Could I take a moment and respond to Gary a bit too?
Of course.
I think Gary's absolutely right there in the sense that we can't not do our own work. I think that's part of what Lee was saying, was that Bohm had said that it's the both and, you know, for one thing, dialogue, and, you know, here, Gary, Patrick Damare is just marvelous in going into this in a way that I think was really beautiful, because he says there's two levels that actually kind of go on simultaneously. And so when we're confronted in a dialogue situation with these controversies between our assumptions and others, that brings about the process that begins to change both the person and the cosmos or the group or whatever. So dialogue has kind of two aspects to it, but you can't really separate it out from the real core responsibility, which even Bohm said, we got to clean up our own thought pollution before we can think we're going to work on having our work really make big impact on the collective level. Now, we can't also not being activists. We have to do that on Earth plane, but the real upstream point is going to be up in the collective. So I just want to validate, you're saying individual, and I would just add to it both and, individual and collective, and they may in fact not go sequentially, they may go simultaneously.
you, Gary, for bringing that in, and thank you for your responses. So we've gone a little bit over. Would you maybe, Beth, be happy to take one more question? Would that be okay?
Yeah, great.
Okay, great. So we'll go to Riza.
Can you hear me okay?
And yes.
Oh, great. Thank you. First of all, I just want to express the joy and gratefulness I feel to be in dialogue with you, and Beth, to hear all of where you've taken this, and you know, this has been a passion of mine for so long, and I had the great gift of getting to work at MIT in the Dialogue Project, training dialogue facilitators, and working with Bohm at Apple's think tank, and continuing that basically through a process that I think of as ecstatic co-presencing. And the reason I call it ecstatic is that there's kind of leaning in as somatic intelligence awakens, the ability of the organism as it becomes more and more.
I think her connection dropped. It's frozen. Oh well, Riza, if you can hear us, maybe you can ask your question on. Oh, you're back. Oh, maybe not. Yeah, sorry, Riza. We your screen is frozen. We couldn't hear you. But if you want to ask your question on Sutra or in the chat, maybe we can deal with that question after the session.
Okay. You can't. Okay.
Yeah, sorry about that. So yes, Beth, Mark, and Lee, would you like to have any closing remarks? Close this session, just to finish off.
I defer to Beth.
Oh, Lee.
So I would just reiterate the many thanks toward Pari and the work that's been done and continues to be done, and the prospects for the future of all the work that Pari has done over many years. I think it's wonderful. And I'm so happy to sit for 2 hours with Mark and Beth and all the rest of the people that have joined us. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Beth.
Well, thank you so much, Lee, for your kind words. Thank you, Beth, for your wonderful presentation. Thank you, Mark and Lee, for contributing. It's been a really interesting session. And thank you for everyone who has contributed, either by asking their question or writing in the chat. Some really interesting things have come out of the chat. And I do apologize again for all of those who wanted to ask their question, but didn't have the opportunity to do so. Yes, so thank you all for joining us. Before we all go, I'd just like to invite you all to tomorrow's session, the last session of this series. Tomorrow we'll be hosting a panel discussion with some of the panelists that we've met in the last few weeks. Panelists include Leroy Littlebear, Beth Macy, Melissa Nelson, Lee Nichol, Hester Reeve, and Dave Schrum. They'll be exploring the different topics that have emerged in the last few weeks. If you can't make it tomorrow, I'd just like to invite you all to the session with Ian McIlgrist that will take place on September 4th. Now, Ian, for those of us that were at the What is Consciousness event earlier this year, Ian McIlgrist couldn't unfortunately attend that session. But he is coming next week. He's going to host a session entitled The Brain and Our Encounter with the World is On. So it should be a really interesting session. There's more information about this on our website, so check it out. Yes, and if anything comes up, you can contact us through our website in the contact us section, or you can write to us on social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, or email us directly at james@participatory.com to contact me, or Eleanor@participatory.com to contact Eleanor. Thank you all again for joining us. Thank you to all of our panelists, and we'll see you again soon here at the Party Center. Bye-bye.